This was all going on many years ago. Most of you might not be aware, but it reminded me of the same thing to the year 2000, the first year I taught here. So that's why I guess I remember it. Anyway, Luther held his own in debates. The squabble began to spread because Luther's ideas caught fire for several reasons. Number one, most people had already begun to think that the self-indulgence were wrong. Erasmus had already laid the egg in people's mind that was about to hatch. Another thing too, with all due respect, the Catholic clergy are generally not good preachers. Even the Pope does not have to be a good preacher. Luther was the next effective speaker. He taught in a college class for several years, and he became an excellent public speaker, something that in general was not true among Catholic clergy. So Luther was able to create a convincing case for what he believed, and the people listened to him. Eventually, the Emperor Charles V, whom I'm going to be mentioning later, called Luther before the council, and Luther made his famous speech there in the court of Charles V. He said, "Unless you can prove me wrong by scripture or plain reason, I will not recant. Here I stand, I can do no other, so help me God." The emperor had guaranteed him safe passage, so Luther was able to leave the emperor's court alive. But some of Luther's friends, particularly knights who were loyal to Frederick the Wise, became concerned, and they waylaid Luther as Luther was leaving Charles V's territory, and they carried him to the castle of Frederick the Wise, where Luther hid away for a year. Frederick was afraid for Luther's life, so he hid him away. And while there, Luther translated the Bible into Germany and wrote several hymns, and laid the groundwork for the faith that was to become the foundation for the Lutheran Church. The Catholic Church, believing Luther was dead, began to spread the sale of indulgences, but Luther wrote to them and said, "Hey, I'm not dead, but if you don't stop your sale of indulgences, you're going to regret it." The church eventually slowed down. Now the church was to outlaw the sale of indulgences, but that's jumping ahead of the story a little bit. Luther went on to believe that the clergy should marry, and as I've already mentioned, he himself married. He helped a nun escape, a nun named Catherine, and married the nun. And they had several children. One of them he named Hans after his father. His father lived long enough to see his grandchildren. The story goes on. Luther began to his ideas began to spread. Now, Scandinavia, particularly Norway, Sweden, and Finland, Denmark, and Iceland, they adopted Lutheranism, and they remain primarily Lutheran to this day, except that modern day Europe doesn't really have much interest in church anymore, but they remain Lutheran, officially Lutheran to this day. As for Germany, Germany consists of more than 100 dukedoms, counties, and principalities, all independent of each other. Germany was not really united. Half of Germany went Lutheran and half remained Catholic. The peasants in Germany revolted, thinking Luther would help them, and Luther wound up going against them, which greatly diminished his standing among the peasants. Luther wrote an article, and folks are going to run into this if you've studied Martin Luther. He told the nobility to stab, smite, slay, kill whenever you can. I mean, it's in the records. And I want to say this about revolts against authority. The Russians revolted against the Tsar, and they got Lenin and Stalin. In my lifetime, the Cubans revolted against Batista, and they got Castro. First one brother, then another. Maybe you catch my drift. You rebel against authority, and you wind up with worse authority. Now, I can name you two men who decided they weren't going to live in their father's house anymore and put up with their father laying down rules. And I want to go somewhere where I can be my own person. Do that. I know what I'll do. I'm going to join the Marines. By the time they got through with the Marines, they thought their daddy was a mild-mannered, soft-spoken man compared to those Marine corporals. And yes, the Marine corporals did tell them, you will clean up your latrine, you will shine your shoes, much more so than your mother and father ever had. This is a mistake a lot of young men make. But anyway, now another thing, all right, about Martin Luther that I must say, I know I'm in the middle of a Jewish community, and let me hasten to state, I'm married to a woman who is part Jewish herself, so I know it. But Martin Luther developed anti-Semitic attitudes. He believed the Jews would accept his theology, and they didn't. So he wound up calling for the extermination of the Jews. Now, why do I say this? I'll tell you this. Every hero you can find. When I was a young man, I had a lot of heroes, and yes, Luther was one of my heroes. But as you get older, you find these heroes of yours often have serious faults. Yeah, my dad was my hero for a while, but then as I get older, he had some serious flaws, and I expect my children to see them in me as I get older and as they get older. Martin Luther called for the extermination of the Jews, and he has been blamed for the Holocaust that occurred in Germany some 450 years later. He was in part to blame. When Germany decided to get rid of all of its Jews, Germany and Poland, both Catholic and Lutherans were involved. Again, all these men. Now, another fault that Luther had, he was extremely set in his ways and would not change. Now, the history book I had when I was a freshman said that Luther had an extreme conviction that he was right, which explains his driving power, but also, it set his limitations. Once you are convinced you're right, you'll never grow anymore after that. If you're this big, when you're convinced you're right, that's all the bigger you'll get. At some point, you always have to remember, I might possibly be wrong. Now, the reason this is important is, down to the south, Zwingli started his own reform movement. And some Protestants said, hey, Luther, you and Zwingli ought to get together. So Zwingli made the trip to see Luther. And they decided they might put their movements together. But they could not agree on the doctrine of the Lord's Supper. And those two movements remained apart, and it has remained separate to this day. Protestantism then started off divided, and it kept dividing and subdividing and dividing and dividing some more and dividing some more until today it's hopelessly divided. Maybe that's good. Why is it good? Because if we only had one gasoline company, that company could charge any price they wanted to and put out a crummy quality part. It's called monopoly. Whereas we have several, each one of them has to make sure they put out a good quality product at a low price in order to stay in business. Same thing perhaps is true with churches. When I was a kid, I used to like to browse my dad's encyclopedias, and guess what? The last entry in the last encyclopedia was this man. And they had a picture of him, and by today's standards, the picture looks horribly ugly. But again, that people at the time judged him by their own standards. If you want to find a man who looks uglier than John Calvin, I believe, might even look uglier than he is. Again, look at some of those old paintings of some of those old people. They would not do in today's world of modern high-definition color television. Would not make a good impression, I'm afraid. All right, so much for that.
Quick question.
Yes.
You said Martin Luther's anti-Semitism was because they did not accept.
They did not accept his theology. In general, now there have always been exceptions. In general, the Jews have not acknowledged Jesus Christ as being the promised Messiah. Yeah. Again, that's theology, but it's also important to know because it exists. You have to understand it, folk, in order to understand what has happened to the Jews down through the ages. One more little story about Luther, then I'll move on away from him. There's a story, I mean, that Luther had problems with depression and bouts with despondency. And one day he was just moping around the house, feeling really down. And in through the door came his wife, Catherine, dressed in funeral clothes. He said, who died, Catherine? She said, God died. He said, oh, wait a minute, Catherine, that is blasphemy. She said, well, he might as well be dead the way you're acting. Luther realized, oops, I better straighten myself up because I'm making a bad impression on my wife, on my children, on my family, everybody else by moping around in a state of dark despondency. Anyway, Luther passed on off the scene, and regrettably we don't know who his descendants were. We followed his descendants for a few generations, then they became lost to history. But to the south, in Switzerland, Zwingli started another reform movement in Geneva. Eventually Zwingli was killed in battle and replaced by a man named John Calvin. Very important because Calvin's doctrine was to influence the Puritans and the Scotch. The Presbyterians are all primarily Calvinists. The Puritans who came over here in 1620 and in the 1630s, the Puritans were largely Calvinist. In France, the Protestant movement in France was also Calvinistic. And unfortunately, the French Protestant movement did not thrive very well. Now, Calvin is remembered for his doctrine of predestination. Essentially, Calvin believed that you were saved or not saved based on whether or not God chose you or didn't chose you. And it was all up to God. It was not up to you. There was nothing we could do to determine our own salvation. And if you think that sounds a little bit harsh and cold, most theologians today also believe the same thing. Even though, again, the doctrine of predestination made a lot of headway, and it gave its followers, supposedly gave its followers courage on the battlefield. The feeling that if I'm going to die, I'm going to, there's nothing I can do about it, and made them totally, in some cases, just outright reckless on the battlefield, which sometimes made them good soldiers. Now, the Southern hero, Stonewall Jackson, was a Presbyterian predestinationist, and he could make all kinds of reckless moves on the battlefield and got away with them time after time. And then one day he went out at night in front of his own men and was shot by his own men. So again, each of you can determine for yourself what you believe. There will be much more said about the doctrine of predestination later, because it was very, very important in Western Protestantism, Western theology. Anyway, Calvin took over after Zwingli and got the Protestant movement going during his time. Now, your book goes on to talk about particularly the English Reformation, and then the Anabaptist. I do have a couple more minutes. I mean, I discussed with the teacher what do you do when you have 2 minutes left and have a topic you want to spend 10 or 20 minutes on. Well, I'm going to start. The English Reformation began with King Henry VIII. At first, Henry VIII was a loyal Catholic, and he wrote a paper denouncing Luther, and Luther wrote a paper denouncing right back, denouncing the king. But Henry, ironically, was the one who broke away. Now, here's the story. Henry VIII was the son of Henry VII. And in those days, these kings wanted to marry off, particularly their heir to the throne, to someone who was really high up in another realm in hopes of uniting their throne with another throne. So Henry VII married off his oldest son, Arthur, Prince Arthur, to Catherine of Aragon. Catherine of Aragon had a chance to get the Spanish throne. I mean, she was related to Charles V, related to Spanish royalty, and had an outside chance of inheriting the throne. She never did. But Prince Arthur died early in the marriage, In fact, we don't even know if Prince Arthur and Catherine ever really met each other. They were married on paper. Well, at the time Prince Arthur died, Catherine was 26, and young Henry, the younger brother of Arthur, was only 10. Nevertheless, their father was so determined that Henry would marry Catherine that normally it was against the church rules for a person to marry his brother's wife, but Henry VII wrote to the Pope and got an indulgency that allowed Henry VIII, his 10-year-old son, to marry Catherine when he turned old enough. So when they were about 16, and she was by this time close to 30, they were married. And they lived together for several years, but Henry became dissatisfied with his aging wife, and also she never bore him a son, she only bore him a daughter named Mary. And he said, in effect, I believe that my problems are because I'm living in sin with my brother's wife. So he wrote a letter to the Pope saying, Your Holiness, I would like a divorce from my wife because I feel like this marriage is sinful. Now, the Pope normally could have granted a divorce, except for one thing. Catherine of Aragon was closely related to Spanish royalty, and actually she was really closely related to Charles V. And the Pope did not want to anger Charles V, so the Pope wrote a letter back to him. Sorry, Henry, the marriage was approved by the former Pope. It stands. You may not marry Catherine. Let me pause. How many ever heard this story before? I guess most of you. Okay. Well, anyway, make a long story short, Henry then decided, well, if the Pope won't grant me a divorce, I'm going to get a divorce anyway. So he proceeded to break away from the church. He got the Archbishop of Canterbury to approve of his divorce. So he divorced his wife, Catherine, married one of Catherine's ladies-in-waiting named Anne Boleyn. And 6 months after the marriage, their daughter Elizabeth was born, who eventually became Elizabeth I. And no, Elizabeth was not premature. The fact is, Elizabeth was conceived while Henry was still married to Catherine of Aragon, which meant that the Catholic Church will tell you to this day that Elizabeth was illegitimate. And I can fully understand why. Anyway,